morning. Welcome to Footy Furnace, a special trade edition. What a final 15 minutes it was tonight. 8 deals in that period of time, and we're going to go through every single one tonight. Let's get straight into it. Damian Barrett, Jimmy Bartel and Kane Cornes, welcome to you. The Hahn hit list is stacked tonight, gentlemen, because there was many trades very late. We can have a look at them there. These are the stories that dominated the trade period and are going to dominate the off-season. Let's get straight into it with Bailey Smith. He was probably, once Christian Petrarca and Clayton Oliver were ruled out, the biggest name of the trade period. And in the end, Damo, he gets to the Cats.
He did in the final few moments. It was the one that was always going to take the longest, and in the end it required the use of 3 other clubs to get involved. St Kilda, the Bulldogs, obviously, and Carlton, and we can see there the exchange of picks and players that ultimately got over the line for Bailey Smith. It was a relief for him because while his management was saying post the period that he was calm about it, he wasn't. He wanted the finality and the fact that he was a Geelong player tonight.
That pick 17 was the crucial one, so that was always going to go to the Dogs, really, Kane, wasn't it? Like, there was no issue there. It's what else they would give up. In the end, it was pick 38, which was on-traded for Matt Kennedy.
Yeah, I mean, so they didn't really get what they demanded that they were going to get. The Western Bulldogs, I like Kennedy to the Dogs. We'll get to them shortly. But in the end, Geelong get a very good player in their prime to solve them a need. There's Paul Connors. He was a running amok trying to get this deal sorted, which eventually he did. But and what a powerful person he has become. There's Andrew Mackie, of course, and these are the scenes. With about 4 minutes, Damo left.
Yeah.
To get this done. But a relief, as you said, for him not to have to sit around for a month and wait of the anxiety to go through to the national draft when Geelong get a player in his prime that solves an absolute need for them.
Yeah, because they were adamant they were going to get him through one of the 2 drafts. They ended up giving up pick 38 as part of all of that. But the fact that he can now train right now as a Geelong player, that was really beneficial to him personally.
Well, let's take a look at the summary, what washed out for the Cats. And we mentioned that pick 17 goes out. And as we spoke on Sunday night, something else probably had to be thrown in the deal, but other clubs benefited, of course. Pick 38 goes out. They got pick 45, 57 and 75 remaining. They got their man. They were after Bailey Smith for quite some time. That extra pick on the end, and we know Geelong with those later picks can find some gems. So I think they've done a pretty solid job. They had one job to do and they got it done. Yeah,
the Cats obviously continue to top up. They didn't get Clayton Oliver. That's a big watch for 12 months' time as well. Caleb Daniel, this is a deal that in the end was just pick 25, Kane. And I don't think it's a surprise in the end that pick 25 was given up, but it took until the final 3 minutes of the trade period for the North Melbourne Football Club to finally get the play that they wanted. Yeah,
so they lose probably on the Bailey Smith deal, don't they, the Western Bulldogs, but they win on that one. Like pick 25 for Caleb Daniel at his stage is an excellent pick, so they would gain some kudos there and have a little win there. The Matt Kennedy thing, you flip out Jack McRae for Matt Kennedy, I think is also an upgrade. So the Western Bulldogs have eased their salary cap concerns, and Caleb Daniel, Damo, gets to North Melbourne.
Yeah, and North had to give that pick up once they identified and wanted to get a player who was contracted. So while they played the long game on, not wanting to give it up, when it came to the crunch, they did, and they had to. So that's the way it played out. And look, it's a good deal for both clubs in their eyes. I'm with you though, Kane. I think they've given up a lot to get someone who probably isn't at his absolute best right now.
Yeah, so I give them a B. I mean, you got to question why 3 pretty established players want out of the footy club, and clearly Luke Beveridge had fallen out with McRae and Daniel and Bailey Smith, who'd played them in the wrong position, so no surprises, and you couldn't be critical of any of those 3 for wanting to leave. Now, the positive is that you get Kennedy in, can play the forward role. He probably costs you half the deal that McRae would cost you, Jimmy, and can play a variety of positions, bring some experience, and is a good clubman. But a B, and I mean, their list is absolutely stacked. And I think, clearly the pressure will be on that club to finish top 4 in the end of the home and away season to give themselves a shot at winning a premiership.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kane. I think, I'm like you, I think they've got plenty on their list, but maybe where those deals will probably help is in the following year, because now they've got the cap relief. And I know they're quality players, but those 3 players did take a fair chunk of the cap when you plus all their contracts together, so they might be in the market next year for somebody.
And who they got out of contract next year? Marcus Bontempelli, Ed Richards as well, Jamara in a couple of years, Sam Darcy next year as well. They're going to need that cap relief. The Jake Stringer trade was very interesting. It looked like it was off, it was back on. In the end, it got done. And there was that pick in the 50s, Jimmy, that was crucial to Jake Stringer becoming a Giants player. Yeah,
of course, Essendon made it known that they were happy for Jake to explore other options. And for the Giants, it's trying to add a bit more experience forward to the footy. They see Jake Stringer as a 40-plus goal forward. Now they Obviously want him to be the professional Jake Stringer, which is always the question marks around him, but there's plenty of protection mechanisms in that space for the Giants, and pick 53 is pretty fair value for a player that you wanted to get out Essendon, and the Giants willing to take the risk.
Be a bit of a hit to his ego, I would have thought Jake. There wasn't a whole lot of love for him, and at one point it looked as though he was going to have to go back to Essendon, which the way that he'd checked out would have been a disaster for him. And just what this means for the Bombers, the language that they're using post the trade period is that we're young. I'm not sure how that's going to sit with Essendon fans saying that we're young, trying to temper the expectations of what they can achieve next year.
It's a little reset.
I know. How many resets do you want, though? Like, I think this fan base has gone, all right, all we have done is probably weakened ourselves. We've probably got younger. We've taken out a player who kicked 42. And I get it. I think they played it perfectly in that sense with Stringer. But I don't think the Essendon fans want them to be talking young and lowering expectations on a group that hasn't delivered for a long time.
Tom, how much more of a reset do you want than sacking a coach in contract, as they did 2 years ago, to bring Brad Scott in? They sacked Ben Rutten because the now was right in front of them, according to the new chairman at the time.
I'm not advocating for their reset. I agree. Impatient fans would be terribly frustrating. Zach Merritt's a 5-time best and fairest. He's yet to play in a winning final. I'm just saying that's how they see it. They see it as a little reset.
It's just changing history.
Again.
They're changing narrative. It's not what they said when they sacked Ben Rutten.
Yeah, they expected to play finals. And to be honest, 3 months ago, you'd think they might finish top 4, if not top 8, and they didn't do that. Hey, the Jake Stringer stuff was intriguing as well, but it was also intriguing because there was some information around the Giants today and a story around the Giants, which was extremely troubling. So I think we should get into that. The information tonight from the Giants is this. Some of the allegations are distressing and entirely contrary to the club's values and policies. There is also a level of misinformation and rumour being circulated, which is entirely inappropriate, particularly while the investigation is ongoing. This clearly relates to a Wacky Wednesday, which at the very least, as I said on 9 News tonight, was inappropriate. At the most, was scandalous. Now, my view on this, my understanding on this, is that the Giants believe that it is a very pointy situation and that there's a few players who clearly did the wrong thing. You know, disgusting outfits and the skits that they performed as well. One of those was Josh Fay, who's a young player, Damo, who came as Jared Hayne with a blow-up doll. But they also believe that the punishments that the AFL is threatening to hand down to the players, specifically the match punishments to the players, is disproportionate to the crime. They're not saying what the players did was all fine, it should be ticked off, but they are saying the level of punishment is just too far. And I think the AFLPA is going to speak about this as well. They're arguing that there should be no match punishments. It should just be a fine, and a heavy fine if needed. So they're the players involved in the skit, of which Josh Fay was one. The other element here is the players that weren't involved in the skit, one of which is Toby Green, who's the captain of the footy club. He's been offered a $20,000 fine. He has to respond to that. There's conjecture about how much input he actually could have had, given how long that skit went for. Regardless, this will play out over the next couple of days, and it's an unfavourable situation for the club. Yeah,
and one that's wholly avoidable, totally avoidable. I mean, don't dress up at the end of a footy season. Don't get together and don't shut out other people out of your room. Leave other people in the room, because then you may not behave the way you do. Now, I'm happy for this to play out the way the AFL sees it, because the use of the word by the club itself, distressing. I mean, that's an interesting word to use in an own club press release. Jimmy, I know you are no longer part of the club as a director, but clearly you've got a line of sight on this, and your take on this is pretty valid right now.
Yeah, look, all the information that Tom just reported on that's pretty much most of the information that I have. And it's pretty difficult to comment while we're still waiting on sanctions, because players are going to decide whether they're going to respond to them, and we haven't actually heard what those sanctions are. So if this was this time next week, I'd probably be able to speak a bit more freer on what is being handed down, but we're still waiting on the response from the AFL.
The other element here is that the two vice-captains weren't there. So Josh Kelly wasn't there, Stephen Caniglio wasn't there. Again, this will play out. Let's talk about James Peatling and that trade to the Adelaide Crows. Damo, this was a complex one in the end. I thought there was a chance that they might walk into the draft, and in the end, they didn't. I don't know what you thought about it, but this was more complex than I think it needed to be.
Yeah, so I think he's the one that hurts the Giants. I think coming in Perryman, you go, OK, we understand this couldn't compete with the offers that was presented to them, and I think they can fill the void there. But Peatling, I just thought he was really important. Jimmy played some big roles. He stood up in big games. He's aggressive, and you can tell by the way that they handled this trade that they were upset that he was leaving.
Yeah, I think they were hoping there was more midfield minutes there at the Giants, but he's gone looking for that elsewhere. And you did touch on it. He did have some big moments that won some games for the Giants. Pretty hard-nosed player, fits that age band bracket. But you're right, you couldn't compete on the Perryman deal. Cummings had some injury issues, but a really good deal, and he's got some connections back to Adelaide. I've given them a B because they've actually picked up some decent compensation picks. I know you can only go on the formula, but losing some players in that middle band that you really like to keep, some core role players, but you can't pay too much for them. So some smart decisions there, and got a pretty good draft hand. So it's been, a B is about above average effort.
Yeah. Do they improve their list?
Well, they get younger.
Yeah.
Now, that could be younger with talent, but you're going to have to wait and find out to see whether that talent's any good.
They just seem to lose players every year. And
Depends what you get from Stringer. We judge that with the output of Jake Stringer. If he kicks you 40 plus and you pair him with Toby Green and Brent Daniels and Jesse Hogan, the forward line's looking outrageously scary, depending what sort of version of Jake you get.
And they held on to Xavier O'Halloran as well, which I think was significant for them. Tom Barris got to the Hawks Damo in the end, and it was always going to be future picks that got the job done.
Well, it was. It ended up being a future first and second belonging to the Hawthorn Footy Club. They had the choice of taking Hawthorns or Carltons. They took Hawthorns. That's an interesting conversation in and of itself. But once they committed to each other, it was always going to get done. Now, the curveball obviously came late in the previous week of the trade period when the Hawks decided to transact with Carlton over that pick 14, which then put the West Coast Eagles on the back foot. But they did get those future first round and second round picks to use as part of that. And when it's all said and done, I feel the Eagles have come out of this better than they would have had they dealt with Hawthorn exclusively initially. That's just my take on it, because...
So they're better for holding off?
Well, it wasn't their call, but they were forced to then pivot, and they did. And
Depends where the Hawks finish, Damo.
Yeah. Well, they've got their own first-round pick next year.
Yeah.
Even if it's finished a similar position to this year, it's still roughly about the pick 14 that they were going to get.
If Hawthorns do what we think they're capable of and finish sort of top four, then that dictates that they probably...
Yeah, but if they finish where they finished again, and it's going to be hard to get back to top six, as you well know.
Yeah.
And they've also got the second-round future and their own future first round if they want to use all of that somehow in a combination to have access to Chad Warner, who right now is out of contract and could be going to Perth at the end of next year.
Well, it depends what West Coast Eagle fan you ask is what grade you give it. I think, as you said, at the start of the trade period, they would have had him down at a D, and as you said, probably saved a little bit in the back end. But always you could have just got for a D as a delisted free agent, but the fact that you needed him for a trade, Baker, Graham comes across and, of course, as unrestricted free agent or restricted free agent. For me, still moving out of pick 3 in a stacked draft, I still personally have some questions over that, and there's some unknowns going into next year. So it was difficult to grade. I finished with a C+ there for me.
Just on the Hawks, I would give them an A for their trade period. I think they did very well. I mean, if you look at their draft picks, they've got 33, 77 and 71. They went and got Josh Battle. They went and got Tom Barras. And they did what they needed to do to compete again next year. I don't know if you agree, Kane, but I think they had an excellent time, even though they gave up those future picks to Carlton.
It's been aggressive. They're probably a year ahead of where they thought they were going to be, identified the need. They've had a lot of access to the draft in recent times from the rebuild that they've had. So the only thing is they're not in the first round of this draft, which everyone says is so strong. That would be the only thing with
Still have time to get back in, maybe. I don't know how they're going to do it.
Maybe, but they have some real flexibility with a couple of their weapons in Sicily and Weddle, where you can play them in different roles. Now that Battle and Barras come in, they're half forwards. They've got the best crop of small half forwards in the game. Their midfield is stacked, providing Will Day plays a full season of football, and they got a strong ruckman and a reasonable tall forward line brigade.
So they've got everything they need.
I think they've got everything they need. Now, I don't know if they can win the premiership, but I think they should be right at the pointy end, playing off in a prelim final with where they're at and the coach that they've got.
I love this Liam Baker trade. Carlton, Richmond and West Coast got together, and in the end, Baker for pick 14, but there was much more to it, including pick 3, Damo, and Liam Baker gets the West Coast Eagles. And I know the Fremantle Dockers thought they were a chance late, but he only had his eyes on the West Coast Eagles.
Yeah, he did, and he's now saying that he was there regardless of Andrew Qualter's appointment. I think it was a sizable kicker to get him there in the end. And look, they made the commitment to him, and while you can question giving up 14 in isolation initially to get him across the line, they're a club of their word, and they used it that way. And they, as I said before, I reckon they retrieved something out of the deal today with those future first and future second coming back in.
The Tigers have 8 picks in the top 24, Kane. It's like nothing we've seen since the Giants came into the competition. The next question is, how do they use it?
It's one of the stories of the draft, isn't it? I mean, what an opportunity for them to quickly rebuild. So it's not going to help them next year, and there's going to need to be a real level of patience with the coach, because their performance is going to slip, if you can slip, from winning 2 games. But that's the draft haul they've got. Gives them some flexibility to trade in and out on draft night. Can they go and approach North Melbourne for that pick 2? These are all the things that they can do, but you can fill every need. Yes, they lost some quality and some back-end draft picks, but this is the rebuild that was obvious to everyone 2 years ago that Damien Hardwick didn't see when he made the Hopper and Taranto trades, but finally they're finally on the same page.
Just to give that draft hand some context, just for those catching up on all of this machination in the past 2.5 weeks, that is the type of draft hand that the expansion clubs, Gold Coast and GWS, got in 2010 and 2011 prior to their initial years in the AFL. So that's what we're dealing with here, and there's some serious pressure on that football club now to absolutely nail it.
Time will tell whether this is the way to rebuild. But if this works for Richmond, clubs might be more ruthless with players in the future and actually getting rid of them so you can get that sort of draft hand.
Well, the next important appointment is development manager, because they go hand in hand. You can have all the picks. We've seen a number of clubs have a lot of picks, a lot of first and second round picks, and still wallow down near the bottom because they haven't got development right.
2,057 games in the last 2 years. There's the names that have gone out the door. Complete changing of the guard over the dynasty that they've had. It's what they needed to do. They were fortunate that they got to trade with clubs that had the picks. So Rioli, the pick 6 and 23, what a bonus. Richmond had the picks. So you see it there, like what you got, 6 and 23. With Fremantle and
10, 11 and 18 comes
Bolton.
back.
Like you would just never, ever have that. And that was the problem for Port Adelaide, is that Dan Houston wanted to go to a club that didn't have the picks. Unfortunately, Port Adelaide were happy just to let him go, and we'll get to them shortly. But
what do you make of this trade?
Well, Fremantle identify the player they want. He feels a need, and if you can get Shea Bolton invested and he can produce what he produced in 2022, which was off the charts in terms of any individual. I had him as a top 10 player in that year. If he's invested, he's frightening, and he feels the exact need that they need. That's front half talent, small forward, can pinch hit on ball and impact on the scoreboard. So they're ready to go, Fremantle, and this moves that they've made suggest that there's going to be some real heat on for them to feature in finals significantly.
There's no easing their way into a finals series and thinking 26 is going to be better than 25. They've just got to go for it next year now that they've got everything they need.
Have to. There's real pressure. So the moves that they made, great, but what that does, it increases the pressure on everyone at that footy club, a club that hasn't won a premiership yet, that this is their time.
Including the senior coach as well, as you said last week. We'll get to the Dockers a little bit later on. Jimmy, how do the Magpies look?
Looking at their trade summary, and I think everyone can see that Collingwood's in for the now, and I think they've achieved what they've wanted to achieve, and then top up with players who can play straight away with some experience. And of course, Dan Houston is a high-quality player they can plug in and play with. That's half-back through the midfield. Perryman can do a number of different roles really well. He can run with the midfield or half-back. So some people go, well, you're trading out their future, but clearly the plan is right now, and I think they address that for right now.
Is it a concern, though, that they didn't have a first-round draft pick this year because of what they did with Lockie Schultz last year, and now, already in 2025, they're without one?
But that's if you're rebuilding, or you're looking to actually refresh the list over the next 2
Well, they're going to have to refresh it in some way, no matter what happens in 2025.
Yeah, but I think they're going to address that either next year or the year after, because what that says to me, and what their list, by keeping the amount of 30-year-olds or plus 30-year-olds they've got, is saying we're pushing for a premiership this year.
And they're going to kick the can down the road as well. They might get Tim Membry. They're going to have a lot of 30-plus-year-olds. They're a big watch if things don't go well.
But again, Tim Membry's a stopgap measure. He's not going to.
But he's also 30.
Yeah.
So
there's another
even the players they're looking at are older. Anyway, Kane, Port Adelaide. This trade of Dan Houston was bizarre, I think, because I was sure they were going to hold on to him if they didn't get the deal they wanted. In the end, they just reneged at the end.
Yeah, I was really shocked by it as well. Tom, when that reported they'd turned their back away on that deal, I was like, well, thank goodness. They're going to have to deal with North Melbourne, or they're going to keep Dan Houston, who was on a contract that was favourable to them for 3 years. Now, have they improved their list for next year?
Clearly
you
not.
have to say no, because you've got in pick 13, which probably goes back after the father, sons and academies, and 29 for Dan Houston. You're seeing what everyone else got, what Tom Barris got, what Rioli got, what Bolton got. This guy's as good as any of those names that were floated and moved clubs, and Port Adelaide were forced into a position. I want to take you back to...
Were they forced, though?
Well, it feels like that to me.
He was contracted.
I can't work out why they have done this.
We know why, though. The managers are so powerful that if you don't move the players when they want to move, it's going to hurt you down the track.
Yeah, but that's your problem. I think you need to be a bit stronger. I agree with you, because this pricked my attention when Jason Cripps, their list manager, said this on 3AW.
Opportunity with Dan. We explored multiple clubs. The Cornes Sports Management Group did an excellent job in allowing us to explore multiple clubs for Dan rather than nominating one, and we feel like we exhausted all those opportunities and we landed what was the best deal available to us in this period.
Yeah, so I just don't buy that at all, because in the end, I asked Chris Davies, why didn't you trade into North Melbourne? And Chris Davies said because Dan Houston didn't want to go there. So Connors didn't say you can go to any club. That would have been good. He's just thanked Paul Connors for an unknown reason. You had Paul Connors as client, who was 3 years left on a contract, break that contract to make your team significantly worse. So the only thing I can say is the reason why they did this was to keep that powerful agent group happy.
I want to listen to Chris Davies on the day one of the trade period. I mean, these words now seem hollow.
We want a good deal, better than fair for a player who, we think, number one, is willing to come back to us if the deal doesn't get done, but also he's now a two-time All-Australian who's, a member of our leadership group, a good player in our club.
I think what we got through the trade period was an understanding that the deal that was done yesterday was probably going to be the best deal that we possibly could do through the trade period for Dan.
Yeah, I would argue that the best deal you could do would be to hold Houston, do Lukosius separately, which you gave a future first for. You're going to get Richards anyway, because you would have got him for a later pick. And then, you hold on to a very, very good footballer.
Ivan Soldo, you had a massive crack at him on this show last week, Kane, and got quite personal. And he responded today on Instagram. He said, let's just clear some things up. The only reason I didn't attend the Port Adelaide Best and Fairest was because it was on the same night as my best friend's wedding that I was the best man for. The club approved it, and it reflects badly on my character. Then Kane's values really clearly don't align. He named you in this post, Kane, and it was clearly pointed. What's your response to that?
Yeah, no, I think there was a wide-ranging reasons why I criticised Ivan. Part of it was the best and fairest, and he's got a reason why he wasn't there. But I've got no doubt he thought that he was saying goodbye to the Port Adelaide Football Club. In fact, he went to them and said, I want to be traded. So the criticism is around wanting the easy way out every time. He wanted the easy way out at Richmond to break a contract because he wasn't the number one ruckman. He went to Port Adelaide because he thought he was going to be the number one ruckman. He quickly realised he wasn't, so then he wants to break another contract and have the easy way out and demand a trade to a club that hadn't agreed to the trade. So I think it's going to be really difficult, as I said last Sunday night, to walk back into the footy club after the way that he hasn't been prepared to dig in and fight for his spot in this team, and once again wanted the easy way out.
They'd had a heads up or a nudge, wink, wink, that he would go to St Kilda, and then they pulled the rug out from under him. I'm not taking sides in this, but that's where he thought he was going, and only because they changed their mind after the event of committing to him, at least verbally, that did this change.
I'd probably want that in writing next time.
You think it's going to be awkward for him to walk back in the club?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But how long does that realistically last?
Well, that depends on him. It depends on what standard he wants to set at training, how much he wants to buy into the team aspects of football. So that will be on him. But if I was his teammate, you wouldn't be thrilled with the way that he's handled himself. Across
the road, Adelaide, I gave them an A+ for their trade period. I think they had an excellent time after missing out on Jack Lukosius early. They brought in Peatling and Cumming, and Neil Bullen was a great get from Melbourne for pick 28, I think it was. And the crucial one here, Kane, is they keep hold of pick 4, which is a prized possession.
No, I agree with you, Tom. I think they've done an excellent job. What it does do, like Fremantle and a couple of other clubs, Jimmy, is that it raises the pressure on expectation. And Matthew Nicks' 6th year. They haven't played finals for 7 years. The Crows fans are hungry, and you bring in 3 ready-made players to make you better.
Well, they have to play finals. In my point of view, it's been the build where people have been patient with Matthew Nicks. They've built the inside. They've got the star forward line. Of course, Phil Thorpe, hopefully we get to see a full season out of him. I think they play a good inside game, but those players that they added actually offer some really good transition. Of course, Neil Bullen plays the same role he does at Melbourne. You had Cumming with some kicking off the half-back line. I think that gives them that little bit that they're missing, which is a bit of class on the outside.
Do you think it's finals or bust for Matthew Nicks next year?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't survive 5 years without even finishing in a single-digit ladder position and not expect to be scrutinised with that list he's now got access to.
Carlton, Kane, they started the trade period with pick 12. They finished it with pick 3.
Yeah, look, I think they've done a reasonable job here. Clearly, their salary cap is an issue, so I think their depth has been tested, particularly with Owies and Kennedy. Probably 2 players you're going to need if you have the injury concerns that they had last year. But to get that pick 3, that is the absolute bonus. The Camporelli twins come in, so you get both of them. They'll match that with the father-son. So 3 really good and 1 gun pick in the draft. And I would hope, Damon, that they're a lot healthier than they were last year, and that will be the difference.
The key to what they do, won't it? Clearly, with what now has gone out, and the movement of the draft pick down to 3, they had their 12, and they got 14 from Hawthorn, and then crunched that together to get 3. And look, it's a big impulse to get the 3. Clearly, it's a good result and a good draft, clearly. But it was basically pick 12 plus a future first and a future second to get that 3. So let's not lose sight of that. It was a big spend to get the 3.
If the Camporellis are sort of somewhere around the 30s, then you're hoping that they're going to be good players as well. So they had that bonus of the father-sons, and I'm just worried a little bit for the salary cap and how many $1 million players that they have.
But
on
clearly
their
fits
list.
though, so how can you be concerned?
Well, for the future, like
right.
DeConey's coming out of contract, you've got Wiedering, you've got Cripps, you've got Curnow, you've got Mackay. There's players, you Walsh, that are all
It's star-driven.
being paid close to $1 million. So players like Kemp at this time next year can be picked off because Carlton just can't afford to pay them what St Kilda would.
And Damo, Kemp, how close was that today to getting done with the Saints? Because Sauce clearly likes him because he drafted him.
Yeah, look, he pushed it as hard as he could.
What did he offer in the end? Was it a future 2?
I think they did come up in the end.
I can't believe they said no to a future 2. You know, like he's a player that isn't necessarily a frontline player. They get a pick that might be in the early 20s next year.
But he helps them win now. I mean, they're in it to win.
So does Kennedy, and they've moved him on.
Yeah, but he clearly, for whatever reason, had fallen out of favour somewhat in terms of being subbed out in a big game. And
He did finish 9th in the best and fairest.
I think in terms of their key position depth and versatility at either end, Michael Voss, like a lot of coaches, needs to win now, and Kemp helps him do that.
And then we talked about contracts before. De Koning is out of contract, as we know, at the end of next year. Becomes a free agent. They've signed Wiedering now on a long-term deal in the past month. Curnow, Mackay, Cripps, Walsh. They're already on good deals. Walsh 2026, but the big signature next week or next year, I should have said, is Tom De Koning.
And does their list want for anything, Jimmy? Carlton?
Well, they're hoping some of these younger small forwards pop, because that's why they were quite comfortable to balk at Owi's deal, or the deal that he was seeking. They're hoping Motlop and Moyer actually pop as small forwards. They need small forwards that actually hit the scoreboard and play as small forwards, not as small key position players.
This Luke Parker trade went down to the wire as well, Damo.
Look, North, once they identified him, once he went public with wanting to get there, they had no choice but to give up the 44 pick, which the Swans wanted and ultimately got for. So they had Jacob Constanti come through to the club as part of that. That was one of the, I suppose, few players we hadn't spoken about prior to the trade period starting. But look, they identified him, North. We can talk about what that means for them when we have a look at their grading later on. But I felt the Swans probably came out of the period as a C. Now, that might be subjective. It clearly is. They lost the grand final really badly. They didn't bring in any players. They lost one of their all-time greats. And I know that the role that he was going to play in 2025 was going to be a diminished role from that high of being one of their all-time greats. But the 19 was the Dylan Stevens trade last year. That's the first pick they've got, and then the 22 is theirs.
And they're trying to get into next year's draft as well, because they've got academy kids coming through. Kane Constanti was going to be delisted. Like, that's just as proper steak knives for Luke Parker. Do you worry that the Swans won't be able to recover from what not just happened this year, but what's happened in recent years in crucial games?
Yeah, psychologically you do. I've been in a position of losing a grand final by 119, so nothing that theirs is nowhere near similar to that, but it ruined the club. Now, when it's happened to you twice in the space of 3 years, it's clearly an issue for them, but they must love their group. Their focus has been on re-signing their guns, which they've done a pretty good job of. But item number one for the whole of the year and until he signs will be the questions they need to ask around Chad Warner and his future.
Yeah, and the other one is John Longmire as well. I think the big question over the summer is if and when they announce a handover to Dean Cox, will that give John Longmire 1 more year, 2 more years? Because that's clear. I don't want to be disrespectful, but that's clearly coming to an end sooner rather than later. It might be a year or two away, but I can't see Longmire being there for 5 or 10 more years. So how they orchestrate that in an era where handovers are traditionally difficult will be crucial.
And equally, right now, you couldn't extend, I wouldn't have thought. And I don't think he would want to be extended right now. That's the way he values his role and within the workings of that club, not just in the current period, but in the entire history. He's a student of the Swans' history. He knows how it works. And there may well be a role for him beyond the coaching of 2025. But to me, you couldn't, as a club, recommit now significantly, given what's happened twice in the past 3 years.
Damo, North Melbourne have finally got some experienced players to come to them. Of course, Jack Darling, we mentioned Luke Parker, Costanti, the steak knives. What do you make of their trade period?
Well, I gave him a C, Jimmy. It could have been a B or B minus maybe. But look, I'm not totally sold on the Darling and Daniel acquisitions. I get why they get Parker more than those other two. And I mean, Daniel's not the 2020 Daniel who made an All-Australian and won a best and fairest. And I get he's a good quality person. He'll get a lot of footy down back. I get Darling is there for the Larky protection. Parker will play a significant role. But I'm just not convinced it's going to work as a collective. I'm really not.
What is working, though? Like, how many games would you want them to win next year with those ins in the trade period?
Well, given they've won 15 in the past 5 years, let's go with 5.
Should they split pick 2?
Which is slow expectations.
It's got to be more than 5.
Well,
so
it hasn't been. It's been 3 on average for 5 years.
So there has to. For me, it's 8. Like you're making these calls. You've re-signed Zerha. Leek Davis-Uniacke is an experienced player now. I mean, they have enough, and they have enough young players that have been there for long enough to go from 3 to 8.
Are any of those 3 players needle movers, though?
No, well, I think what Daniel is the knock-on effect, because you get McKercher off the half-back flank and you bring him up through the middle of the ground, and particularly wing is probably his next move before going inside. But I'll answer your question, Tom. I'd consider splitting pick 2 if I'm North Melbourne, if you get something worthwhile in multiple picks, because we've seen them draft midfielder after midfielder after midfielder, and if you're in pick 2, the best players in the very pointy end of midfielders, it's worth a consideration of not overreaching at pick 2, because some key position talent is probably a bit further back in the first round, and you can probably see a little bit more comfortably and have a stab. You could probably still get your midfielder and then have a swing at probably the next best key position player.
I look at Parker, Daniel and Darling. I actually think of Bernie Vince and Daniel Cross and Chris Dawes and these guys that came into Melbourne
Jordan
and just
Lewis.
helped stabilise. Well, then got Lewis.
Bernie Vince was younger than 2 of those 3.
Yeah, but it just stabilised the club for a bit and then allowed them to go and get Steve May and Jake Lever and these guys. But it has to be a staggered approach. And one eye on Richmond as well to come for that pick 2. Interesting to see if they want the top 2 picks in the draft. Welcome back to Footy Furnace. It's time to have a look at your club's list health thanks to grilled healthy burgers. You love a grilled healthy burger, Jimmy. And the Fremantle Dockers, where are we going to start?
Sure. Tom, Freo, of course, you touched on this, Kane. Bolton is a top 10 talent when he's absolutely firing. He's breathtaking. He had some dynamic firepower on the forward line. You throw in Amos and the big kahuna, Tracy there. I think they're always solid down back. They probably need more scoring from out of their midfield. Their midfielders get a lot of the ball. They're fantastic. Sarong, Brayshaw, Young can... he's permanent midfielder now. He's an absolute star of the game. So you throw in Bolton, I think they've gone and got someone with a bit of talent. They're getting back that pick 14, so still have a really good pick. I think they did a pretty solid job, the Dockers, but they've got to play finals and play more attractive, open, free-flowing football, because they can defend, but they've got to open it up a bit.
The back 6 is really good. There's the record, and their recent finishes under Justin Longmuir, who they're not sure of. If they were sure on him, if they thought he was their next premiership coach, you would have a long-term deal in front of him, Damo. But I'm not sure how they play this, but they're sort of half in with this coach.
I'd leave it as it is. They decided roughly 12 months ago to just add the 2025 year to what he already had with 2024. Now, that ultimately didn't mean much because they're still in the unknown period where they got 10th. And just on that 2022 year, they were 41 points down in an elimination final that year. I mean, it looks good to see 5th, but they were 7 goals down in their first final. So, yeah, like Matty Nicks, he just has to hit it and not just make it and win or nearly win an elimination final. They've got to get all the way through to a prelim.
They're at risk of being irrelevant if they don't play finals next year.
But high-end finals, Tom, not just get in and make week 2.
They've got their midfield is unbelievable. Andrew Brayshaw is going to command, $1.2, $1.3 million a year. Caleb Sarong might win a Brownlow. So I agree with you completely. Next year is massive for Justin Longmuir and the Dockers, as it is for the Demons, Damo. Clayton Oliver and Christian Petrarca are staying.
Well, they're probably the biggest stories out of the trade period for the Demons, given the noise around both of them and both wanting to get out before it. We saw them, what they did with those. They pick 5 and 9 to get involved in there. They bring in Sharp from a Brisbane Lions team. He was an emergency in that particular grand final. Obviously, Alex Neil-Bullen is a massive out for them to have him no longer part of their operations, and he's off to the Crows. So I gave him a B. I mean, you could say that's maybe too high given what they did lose, but they have got a good draft hand with what they did.
Too conservative with their ball use, too defensive game style. They're stuck in 2006 Melbourne. They need to get a game style that is more conducive to playing in 2025. That'll be on the coach Simon Goodwin, who comes with a little element of pressure on himself, even though he has won a premiership in recent years. But pressure is on this footy club. The draft hand is great, but they still haven't solved their midfield connection issues with their forwards, and there's some young players that I really like. But a lot is on the coach and his assistants to come up with a game plan that is effective and can take the game on a bit more.
Jimmy, did they do the right thing holding on to Petrarca and Oliver? Sounds like a ridiculous question given how talented those two players are, but if they explored it, they could have actually revitalised their list even more.
Yeah, but that's assuming that they would have got the deals and who was the trade partners. We're talking with a number of clubs that the trade partners those players were probably going to go with probably didn't have the capital. So, work on your communication, work on getting your club stable and strong, and you can get those two players back firing. You got pick 5 and 9. You add that to Windsor, who showed enough as a young talent. McVie, I think, is a rising star down back, or already is. Pickett's still young. Rivers is still young.
But those two players were disgruntled.
They'll just what, you can't patch up a relationship?
No, well,
what,
I think
anytime you have any confrontation, you just flick it?
No, I think Petrarca comes back in and he's a professional, but there's a question mark whether Clayton Oliver comes back in and is a professional.
Big question mark. Big question mark. And I think the club's got to drive them really hard, both of them. I think they've been too nice and stepping around Christian and making sure his needs are met now. No, you've got to coach this group really hard. And, I mean, there's a level of expectation on Clayton that he's the player that he can get back to being. Otherwise, we'll look back and go, they should have traded him. Let's move on to the Saints, Tom, because they didn't do a whole lot. And they're a team that probably did need to do a bit. So McRae comes in. I don't know. Does he help their midfield, which already has a sameness about it and it lacks leg speed? They've got some nice pieces on the edges and their run and carry is good. The draft picks are terrific. They've got the bonus with the battle compensation pick. So to take those 2 picks, 8 and 9 to the draft, is good. But in terms of significantly improving themselves, I haven't seen it.
No, their biggest achievement was conning the AFL into a pick 8 compensation pick for loss of Josh Battle in the secret herbs and spices.
You just can't let it go, can you, Damo?
Well, it wasn't had anything to do with their nous to get that pick 8. And if you tell me he's worth pick 8 under any formula,
We discussed this last week.
Yeah.
You know my thoughts.
Well, you fall for it.
Well, I think just
you fall for the spin.
I completely disagree. I think pick 8 was based on where they finished on the ladder. Like, if they won the flag, this would have been pick 19. If they finished last, it would have been pick 2. So, the formula is the formula. And no one's seen it. I get that. So I get it's right to be sceptical. But to say they con the AFL into doing it, I think is just a gross over-representation.
And just with their forward line, I mean, Max King, they've been so reliant on for so long. They will be again. The reason to get Soldo was that Marshall could play more forward and he had been an effective forward, a genuine forward towards the back end of the year. Well, they can't do that now because they've got no ruck depth to help Rowan Marshall. And if memory goes as well, there's another reasonable goal kicker. So what have you done there? Maybe they look to the delisted free agent market, but nothing really to get excited about.
Welcome back to Footy Furnace. Kane Cornes, you've been extremely critical of the Gold Coast Suns in the past. How do you rate their trade period?
Yeah, well, they've done everything they needed to do. Now, you go, well, they paid just the most insane price for a 27-year-old halfback in Dan Rioli, but it just doesn't matter to them because of the access that they've had to the academies. And what they've done here is finally had their salary cap, Jimmy, in an excellent position. Their salary cap where they've overpaid players like the Koshis on pure potential and not performance. So they'd be feeling really comfortable about it. But once again, you bring in Noble, you bring in Rioli. You're winning now. I don't want to hear any more excuses we are winning now and we're winning finals now because you've got a coach that you think can get you there. When you sacked Stewie Dew, you said, all right, we must play finals. You didn't do it last year. There's no excuses now.
Well, I think Craig Cameron echoed those thoughts, Kane.
I mean, time's now, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to say the coach is overseas, so I can probably say what I like. But no, the time's now. We've absolutely got to have a go now, which is why we brought in mature players this year. It's really important for us to do it. Last year we brought in 4 young players in the first round, so it's important for us to keep. We've been third or least experienced team for a long time now, and it's important for us to keep going forward.
That's how you win an Alf Brown. You asked the big questions, of course, Craig Cameron there, so I'll take some notes. But if you thought it was an essay reading all those picks in and out, and I'm with you, Kane, get ready for it again next year. They've got so much talent coming through their pathways. Zeke Euland's the next name that'll come in. So they want to play with a bit of speed. You have a look at what they've targeted, of course, Noble and Rioli. I just listed some names. There's about 12 guys who can come off the half-back line. So, again, I think Gold Coast have to play finals because it's got to happen.
Are we ruling out Dustin Martin at the Gold Coast Suns?
I'm not ruling him out, no.
Really?
No. I'm not ruling him in, but there's no need for it to have been done in this period, as we know. So he's probably got to, the SSP period of the season, the late February period. And you'll notice Rory Atkins came off on that list. Yeah. There's about $450,000, which would help the Dustin Martin quest.
There's a spot. Their Queensland rivals, the Brisbane Lions, well, they had a fairly inactive trade period from a player acquisition perspective, but they got the draft pick hand required to get their 2 players in, Sam Marshall and Levi Ashcroft. I gave them a B+. It's probably a bit harsh. It could easily be an A because their list wants for nothing, Kane. And
well, they want
they
for something.
They got the best young player in the country.
They want for a Joe Danaher.
That's fair. Yeah, true.
Which they haven't been able to, and you're never going to be able to solve that issue.
Did they try, though? Did they try to go and get someone for Joe Danaher? Because the way Dom Ambrosio was talking was there was no one that was really out there available to them.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because they did have a runway on this of knowledge, at least key people at the footy club. So while it was a shock to the footy industry come grand final eve, grand final day, grand final post, it wasn't to them. So the fact that they were able to get through this period without getting anyone in, which suggests to me they would have tried long in advance and got knows on the availability this year, but doesn't mean they won't have a crack next year.
And Devon Robertson stays at the Brisbane Lions as well after flirting with moves to the West Coast Eagles and Collingwood to an extent.